The old woman's hands trembled as she watched the bulldozers tear through her land, cutting off the spring that had fed her family for 3 generations. But Sarah Chen wasn't just any farmer, she was a retired hydrological engineer who knew exactly how much water flowed beneath Millbrook's shining new development. As she stood in the ruins of her dreams, calculating flow rates and pressure differentials in her head, one thought crystallized: if they wanted to play with water, she'd show them what happened when you built $1 million neighborhood on sand. Some foundations, she realized, weren't meant to last. The morning Sarah Chen lost her water was the same morning Millbrook Development broke ground on their luxury subdivision. She stood in her kitchen, turning the faucet handle with the muscle memory of 73 years, and nothing came out but a hollow wheeze. "Thomas," she called to her grandson, who was hunched over his laptop at the kitchen table, coffee growing cold beside a stack of unpaid bills. "The well's gone dry." Thomas looked up, his face already wearing the defeat of a man who'd seen too many small catastrophes pile up into one insurmountable mountain. At 28, he'd inherited not just his grandmother's farm, but the weight of keeping it alive in a world that seemed determined to squeeze out every small operation like theirs. How's that possible? The springs never failed, not even during the drought of '88. Sarah's eyes were already fixed on the horizon, where yellow machinery crawled across what had been the Morrison property until 6 months ago. The Morrisons had sold to Millbrook for enough money to retire to Florida, leaving behind 40 acres of prime valley land and the headwaters of the natural spring that had fed the Chen farm since 1951. "Because they are diverting it," Sarah said quietly. "Look." Through the kitchen window, they could see the excavators working in a methodical line, their buckets biting deep into the earth. A concrete culvert system was already taking shape, channeling the spring water into a decorative pond system for the future residents of Millbrook Estates, where nature meets luxury. Thomas joined her at the window, and Sarah felt his body go rigid with understanding. Without the spring, their 100-acre organic farm was just expensive dirt. They'd lose everything: the vegetable operation that supplied 3 farmers' markets, the small herd of heritage cattle, the farmhouse that had sheltered 4 generations of her family. "There's got to be laws," Thomas said, but his voice carried no conviction. "There are. But Millbrook has lawyers who know how to work around them." Sarah's voice was steady, but her hands weren't. She'd been fighting Millbrook Development for 2 years, ever since they'd started buying up every piece of land in the valley. They filed for water rights based on beneficial use for their development. 150 new homes trumps one small farm, according to the county commissioners. The sound of truck engines grew louder as more equipment arrived at the construction site. Sarah watched a surveyor marking grades with fluorescent spray paint, transforming the natural slope of the land into something that would accommodate roads and storm drains and the kind of manicured lawns that required constant irrigation. "We could drill a new well," Thomas suggested, though they both knew they couldn't afford it. "Even if we could, it wouldn't matter. They are not just taking our water, Thomas. They are taking the whole aquifer." Sarah's engineering background hadn't faded with retirement. She could read the landscape like a blueprint, understanding how water moved through soil and stone in ways that most people never considered. That spring feeds into 3 underground streams. By the time they are done with their development, every well within a mile will be affected. As if summoned by her words, a black SUV with Millbrook Development logos pulled into their driveway. Sarah felt her jaw tighten as she recognized the man stepping out, Richard Hawthorne, Millbrook's lead developer, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. "Grandmother," Thomas warned, but Sarah was already heading for the door. Hawthorne was in his 50s, with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from winning more battles than he lost. He'd been visiting farms throughout the valley for months, making offers that started generous and became increasingly insistent. The Chen farm was one of the last holdouts. "Mrs. Chen," he called out as she emerged onto the front porch. "I wanted to speak with you about how you stole my water." Sarah cut him off. "No need for conversation, Mr. Hawthorne. I know exactly what you've done." Hawthorne's smile never wavered, but his eyes went cold. "Now, Mrs. Chen, that's quite an accusation. Millbrook Development has followed all legal procedures for water allocation. The county approved our usage permits months ago. Legal doesn't mean right." "Perhaps not. But it means final. He gestured toward the construction site, where workers were laying the foundation for the first model home. Progress waits for no one, Mrs. Chen. The valley is changing whether you adapt or not. Thomas appeared beside his grandmother, and Sarah could feel the anger radiating from him like heat from a furnace. She's lived here her whole life, he said. This land has been in our family since 1951, yes, I know the history. Hawthorne pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. Which is why I'm here with one final offer. Millbrook is prepared to purchase your property for fair market value plus 20%. That's nearly $2 million, Mrs. Chen. More than enough to relocate and start over somewhere else. Sarah looked at the envelope without taking it. $2 million. It was more money than she'd ever seen, more than enough to set up Thomas somewhere else, maybe closer to the city where he could find work that didn't depend on the whims of weather and water rights. But it would also mean the end of everything her late husband had built. The end of the only life she'd ever known. What if I say no, she asked. Hawthorne's smile turned predatory. Well, that would be unfortunate. You see, without water, this property isn't really suitable for farming, is it? The county assessor will have to adjust the tax valuation accordingly. Higher taxes on land that can't produce income. He shrugged. People lose their property for less. The threat hung in the air between them like smoke. Sarah felt Thomas tense beside her, saw his hands clench into fists. But she also felt something else, a cold clarity that she hadn't experienced since her engineering days, when a miscalculation could cost lives and every decision mattered. I need time to think, she said. Of course. But don't take too long. Construction waits for no one, and neither do market opportunities. Hawthorne set the envelope on the porch railing and walked back to his SUV. Before getting in, he turned back one more time. Oh, and Mrs. Chen. You might want to have your well inspected. I'd hate for you to experience any water quality issues from the construction next door. The SUV pulled away, leaving a cloud of dust that settled on everything like a layer of defeat. Sarah watched until it disappeared around the bend, then picked up the envelope. The paper felt expensive between her fingers, thick and smooth like everything else Millbrook touched. Grandmother, Thomas said softly. Maybe we should consider, no. The word came out harder than Sarah intended, but she meant it. They think because I'm old, because I'm just a farmer now, that I'll roll over and let them take everything. But what choice do we have? Without water, there's always a choice, Thomas. Sometimes you just have to be willing to pay the price for it. Sarah walked back into the house, her mind already working. In the small office where she kept the farm records, she pulled out a filing cabinet that hadn't been opened in years. Inside were the blueprints and geological surveys from her engineering career, 40 years of designing water systems, flood controls, and foundation work for projects all over the state. She spread the documents across the desk, her fingers tracing familiar lines and calculations. Soil composition data, water table depths, drainage patterns, all the information she'd need to understand exactly what Millbrook was building on. As she worked, Thomas brought her coffee and tried to ask questions, but Sarah was deep in the zone she remembered from her professional days. Numbers and equations flowed through her mind like the water that had been stolen from her land. She was calculating something, but Thomas couldn't tell what. Outside, the sound of construction continued. Concrete trucks rumbled past the driveway, carrying the raw materials for Millbrook's dream development. The first foundation was poured that afternoon, a perfect rectangle of grey concrete that would soon support a 4-bedroom colonial with granite countertops and a 3-car garage. By evening, Sarah had covered the desk with charts and calculations. Her engineering textbooks were stacked beside her, pages marked with sticky notes and margin scrawls. She looked like she had when Thomas was a child and she was working on some impossible project for the county, focused, determined, and slightly dangerous. What are you planning, grandmother? Sarah looked up at him, and for the first time all day, she smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. They want to play with water, Thomas. But they don't understand what water can do. She tapped the geological survey of the Morrison property, now Millbrook Estates. Do you see this soil composition? Sandy. Loam over clay with a high water table. Perfect for farming, but... She made another calculation. Dr. Patricia Vance arrived on Thursday in a dusty pickup truck loaded with equipment that looked like it belonged on a NASA mission. Sarah watched from her kitchen window as her old colleague climbed out, still recognizing the purposeful stride. And the way Patricia surveyed a landscape like she was reading its secrets. It had been 15 years since they'd worked together, but Patricia Vance looked like she could still outwork engineers half her age. Her graying hair was pulled back in the same practical ponytail she'd worn in grad school, and her field clothes had the worn soft look of someone who spent more time outdoors than in boardrooms. "Sarah Chen," Patricia called out, grinning as she approached the house. "You look exactly the same. How do you manage it?" "Clean living and righteous anger," Sarah replied, but she was smiling too. It felt good to see someone who remembered her as more than just another elderly farmer fighting a losing battle. They embraced on the front porch, and Sarah caught the familiar scent of Patricia's field work, soil samples and equipment oil, and the kind of scientific determination that didn't fade with age. "Thomas," Sarah called. "Come meet someone who might be able to help us." Thomas emerged from the barn where he'd been attempting to repair an irrigation system they couldn't afford to replace. His clothes were streaked with mud and frustration. But he managed a polite handshake when Sarah made the introductions. "Dr. Vance specializes in hydrological disputes," Sarah explained. "She's helped farmers from California to Maine fight development companies that think water rights come with purchase orders." Patricia's expression grew serious as she looked toward the Millbrook construction site. Even from half a mile away, they could see the machinery working, the raw earth being shaped into suburban dreams. "Tell me everything," she said. For the next hour, Sarah laid out the situation while Patricia took notes and asked sharp, technical questions. She wanted to see the original geological surveys, the water rights documentation, and the county's environmental impact assessment for the Millbrook development. The county did require an environmental impact assessment, didn't they? Patricia asked. Thomas and Sarah exchanged glances. "We assumed so," Thomas said. "Don't they always?" Patricia's expression darkened. "They should. Any project that diverts natural water sources should trigger a mandatory assessment. Let me make some calls." While Patricia worked her phone, calling contacts at the county planning office and state environmental agency, Sarah showed her the technical documents she'd been studying. Patricia's eyebrows rose as she flipped through the geological surveys and soil composition charts. "Sarah, this is brilliant work. You always did have an eye for reading landscapes." Patricia paused at a chart showing the water table depths across the development site. "But look at this. Do you see the pattern?" Sarah leaned closer. The numbers showed something she'd missed in her initial analysis. The water table wasn't uniform across the development site. In some areas, it was only 18 inches below the surface. "Seasonal flooding," Sarah breathed. "During heavy rains, half that development will be underwater. Worse than that. Look at these soil permeability rates." Patricia pointed to another section of data. "The clay layer you identified. It's not just unstable when saturated. It's practically impermeable. Water that gets into that soil has nowhere to go." They were interrupted by Patricia's phone ringing. She answered it with a sharp, "Vance here," then listened for several minutes, her expression growing increasingly grim. "That was my contact at the county," she said after hanging up. "There's no environmental impact assessment on file for the Millbrook development." "That's impossible," Thomas said. "There have to be laws." "There are. But Millbrook classified their project as a minor residential development and applied for expedited permitting. They claimed the water diversion was temporary and minimal." Patricia's voice was tight with controlled anger. Somehow, they convinced the county commissioners that decorative ponds and landscape irrigation didn't constitute a significant environmental impact. Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. How is that legal? It's not. But it's the kind of legal gray area that good lawyers can exploit if no one's paying attention. Patricia gathered her equipment from the truck. "The good news is, we can challenge it. The bad news is we need proof that they are causing significant environmental damage. What kind of proof? Thomas asked. Patricia hefted a device that looked like a metal detector crossed with a computer. The kind that requires getting up close and personal with their construction site. For the rest of the afternoon, Patricia conducted what she called a preliminary assessment of the Chen property. She took soil samples, measured water table depths, and used instruments Sarah didn't recognize to test water flow patterns and soil stability. The results confirmed Sarah's worst fears. The spring that had fed their farm for 3 generations wasn't just diverted, it was essentially gone. Millbrook's culvert system had captured nearly 90% of the natural flow, channeling it into their artificial water features. The impact goes beyond your property, Patricia explained as they studied her readings. This spring system feeds into the Cedar Creek watershed. Every farm and well within 5 miles is going to be affected. Can we stop them? Thomas asked. Patricia was quiet for a long moment, studying the data. Legally? Maybe. But it would take months, maybe years. And Millbrook has deep pockets for legal battles. Sarah felt the familiar weight of defeat settling on her shoulders. So they win. Again. I didn't say that. Patricia's smile was sharp and professional. Legal challenges aren't the only way to fight this kind of battle. Sometimes you have to make the problem too expensive to ignore. She pulled out a tablet and showed them aerial photographs of the Millbrook site, overlaid with her soil and water data. Look at this. See how they've graded the land for drainage. They are channeling all the runoff toward the lowest point of the development, right where they've built their first model home. Sarah studied the images, her engineering background filling in the details Patricia wasn't saying. The foundation work. They cut into the clay layer to pour the footings. Exactly. And clay doesn't forgive that kind of disruption. One good rainstorm and that foundation is going to settle unevenly. Cracks in the basement walls, doors that won't close, maybe even structural damage. Thomas was beginning to understand. So we wait for a storm. We don't wait, Sarah said quietly. We create one. Patricia looked at her sharply. Sarah, I can't be part of anything illegal, nothing illegal. Just thorough scientific documentation. Sarah's mind was working the way it used to during her engineering days, seeing solutions that others missed. You said you needed proof of environmental damage. What if that damage happened to coincide with natural weather patterns? Patricia studied Sarah's face for a long moment, then looked at the weather app on her phone. There's a storm system moving in this weekend. Significant rainfall expected. And storms sometimes cause unexpected problems with drainage systems, Sarah continued. Blockages, overflow, that sort of thing. Temporary blockages, Patricia said slowly, that might cause water to pool in unintended areas. Areas where unstable soil couldn't handle the additional moisture load. They looked at each other, understanding passing between them without words. Thomas watched the exchange with growing alarm. Are you talking about sabotage? He asked. We are talking about scientific observation, Patricia said. Environmental monitoring during a natural weather event. What if someone gets hurt? Thomas pressed. What if no one's going to get hurt? Sarah cut him off. The model home is empty. The site is closed at night. We are just going to help nature demonstrate why building on unstable soil is a bad idea. That evening, while Thomas wrestled with his conscience, Sarah and Patricia walked the property line between the Chen farm and the Millbrook development. In the gathering darkness, they studied the culvert system that had stolen Sarah's water, noting access points and drainage patterns. The main diversion channel runs right under that equipment staging area, Patricia observed. If something were to block it temporarily during heavy rain, the water would have to find another path. Sarah finished. Probably straight through the construction site. They spent another hour identifying what Patricia called natural vulnerabilities in the Millbrook site, areas where soil composition and grading would concentrate flood water, places where temporary drainage problems might cause maximum demonstration of the site's unsuitability for development. The timing has to be perfect, Patricia warned. Too little water and there's no visible impact. Too much, and we could cause real damage. Not we, Sarah corrected. Me. This is my fight, Patricia. I won't drag you into it. But Patricia shook her head. You think I came all this way just to take some soil samples? Sarah, I've been fighting these battles for 20 years. I've seen too many family farms destroyed by developers who think money trumps everything else. Her voice carried an edge of personal pain. My own family lost their ranch to a shopping mall when I was in college. I know exactly what you're going through. They walked back to the house in comfortable silence, both of them understanding that they'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Thomas was waiting on the porch, high. The rain began Friday evening as a gentle drumming on the farmhouse roof, but by midnight it had transformed into something altogether more serious. Sarah stood at her kitchen window, watching sheets of water sweep across the valley in waves. That caught the security lights of the construction site and turned them into blurred halos of yellow. Patricia had left after dinner, officially returning to her hotel but actually parking her truck in a grove of trees half a mile away where she could monitor the situation without being seen. Thomas had reluctantly agreed to drive to Portland, though not before setting up a camera system to document what he called natural weather patterns and their effects on local drainage systems. For the insurance companies, he'd said, his voice carefully neutral, in case there are any claims filed after the storm. Now Sarah was alone with the rain and 40 years of engineering knowledge and a plan that felt both inevitable and terrifying. She'd spent the afternoon making final preparations, studying the construction site through binoculars, timing the security patrol routes, and identifying exactly where strategic drainage interventions would have maximum effect. The Millbrook site had no overnight security beyond motion-activated lights and cameras focused on the expensive equipment. The partially built model home sat in darkness, its foundation already showing hairline cracks that the construction crew had been blaming on normal settling. At 2 a.m., Sarah put on her old rain gear and work boots and walked out into the storm. The wind drove the rain horizontally across the fields, and she had to brace herself against gusts that threatened to knock her off her feet. But this was farmer weather, the kind of storm she'd worked through countless times in her younger years. The property line between her farm and the development was marked by a chain-link fence that Millbrook had installed to keep out trespassers. But the fence ended at the creek bed, where erosion and shifting soil had created a gap just wide enough for a determined 7 to 3-year-old woman to squeeze through. Sarah made her way carefully across the construction site, her flashlight beam revealing a landscape transformed by the storm. Water was already pooling in low areas and the carefully graded drainage channels were struggling to handle the volume. The main culvert system that diverted her spring was working exactly as designed, channeling water away from the natural floodplain and toward the decorative ponds. But culvert systems, Sarah knew from experience, were vulnerable to blockage. A few strategically placed debris piles, some shifted earth, a drainage grate temporarily covered, small interventions that could redirect massive amounts of water during a storm like this. Her first target was the main diversion channel, a concrete-lined conduit that carried the spring water under the access road. The channel was already running at near capacity, and Sarah could see places where debris had naturally collected against the grading systems. Working quickly, she gathered fallen branches and construction debris, materials that would look like natural storm accumulation to any investigator. She arranged them carefully at key drainage points, not blocking the flow completely but creating restrictions that would force water to find alternative paths. The alternative path, according to her calculations, led directly through the lowest section of the development where the model home's foundation sat on the least stable soil. Her second intervention was more subtle. The storm drain system for the development relied on a series of catch basins designed to handle normal rainfall. But Sarah had studied the engineering specifications during her research, and she knew the system was undersized for a storm of this magnitude. She found the main catch basin near the model home and carefully adjusted the grading, using techniques she'd learned during her engineering career for managing emergency flood situations. Not sabotage, just the kind of maintenance adjustment that might happen naturally during a severe storm. As she worked, the rain intensified. Water began flowing in new patterns across the construction site, following the paths of least resistance that Sarah had helped create. She could see the model home's yard beginning to flood as the overwhelmed drainage system backed up. But the real test would come when the diverted spring water found its way to the foundation. Sarah was making her way back toward the fence line when she heard the sound of a vehicle engine cutting through the storm. Headlights swept across the construction site as a security patrol made an unscheduled round, probably responding to motion sensor alerts triggered by the flooding. She dropped to the ground behind a pile of construction materials, feeling cold mud soak through her rain gear. The security guard's flashlight beam swept the area where she'd been working, but the storm made visibility nearly impossible beyond a few feet. Probably just the wind setting off the sensors, she heard the guard say into his radio. "Everything looks normal. Water's backing up a bit, but that's what you get with this kind of rain." The patrol car moved on, but Sarah waited another 10 minutes before emerging from her hiding place. Her heart was pounding in a way it hadn't since her engineering days, when split-second decisions could mean the difference between saving a project and watching it fail catastrophically. By the time she made it back to her farmhouse, she was soaked through and exhausted. But as she toweled off and made hot coffee, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: the satisfaction of work well done. The storm continued through Saturday morning, and Sarah watched from her windows as water levels rose across the valley. The natural creek that ran through her property was running higher than she'd seen in years, fed by runoff from the hills and the water that Millbrook's culvert system couldn't contain. Patricia called at noon with a professional update on weather conditions and their potential impact on construction sites. Significant pooling observed in low-lying areas, Patricia reported in the careful language of an official assessment. Soil saturation approaching critical levels in sections with clay substrates. Drainage systems appear to be experiencing capacity issues. What she meant was, it's working. By Saturday evening, the storm had moved on, leaving behind a landscape transformed by standing water and saturated soil. Sarah walked the perimeter of her property, ostensibly checking for storm damage but actually observing the results of her night's work. The construction site looked like a disaster zone. Water stood in pools throughout the development, and the access roads were muddy rivers that would be impassable for days. But the real damage was less visible, the kind of damage that would only become apparent when engineers examined the foundation systems and soil stability reports. Thomas returned Sunday morning, arriving with a truck full of grocery supplies. And the carefully neutral expression of someone who didn't want to know details. "How was the storm?" he asked, unloading bags of flour and coffee. "Intense," Sarah replied. "You should see what it did to the construction site." They walked together to the edge of the property, where they could see Millbrook workers arriving to assess the damage. Men in hard hats and rain boots were wading through standing water, taking photographs and making notes on clipboards that they tried to keep dry under plastic covers. "Looks pretty bad," Thomas observed. "Natural disasters often are," Sarah said mildly. By Monday morning, Patricia had returned with her official equipment to conduct what she called a post-storm environmental assessment. She worked methodically across both properties, taking soil samples and water measurements and documenting everything with the kind of scientific precision that would hold up in court. The results, when she presented them Tuesday afternoon, were damning. Significant groundwater infiltration in the foundation area, Patricia reported, spreading her data across Sarah's kitchen table. Soil stability compromised throughout the development site. The clay layer has become saturated beyond safe construction parameters. Sarah studied the technical readouts, recognizing the signs of exactly what she'd hoped to achieve. What does that mean for the houses they are building? It means they have a serious problem. The model home's foundation is already showing settlement issues, cracks in the basement walls, separation at the footings. If they continue construction without addressing the underlying soil problems, they are looking at millions of dollars in future damage claims. Thomas leaned over the data, trying to understand the implications. "So what happens now?" "Now," Patricia said with satisfaction, "we file an official complaint with the State Environmental Agency. Unauthorized water diversion, inadequate environmental assessment, construction on unsuitable soil. Millbrook has violated about a dozen different regulations." That afternoon, Richard Hawthorne arrived at the Chen farm in a considerably less confident mood than his previous visit. His expensive suit had been replaced by work clothes, and his aggressive smile was nowhere to be seen. Mrs. Chen, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. I understand you've had some sort of environmental consultant examining our construction site. Dr. Vance is conducting a routine post-storm assessment, Sarah replied calmly. It's standard procedure after significant weather events. Standard for whom? For people who care about proper environmental protection. Hawthorne's jaw worked for a moment before he continued. Mrs. Chen, I'm going to be direct with you. The storm caused. The state environmental inspectors arrived on a grey Thursday morning, driving unmarked vehicles and carrying equipment that looked far more sophisticated than anything Patricia had used. Sarah watched from her kitchen window as they methodically worked across the Millbrook site, taking soil samples and water measurements and photographing every crack in the model home's foundation. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the lead inspector, knocked on Sarah's door around noon. She was younger than Sarah had expected, maybe 40, with the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent her career cleaning up other people's environmental messes. Mrs. Chen. I'm Dr. Walsh from the State Environmental Agency. I'd like to ask you a few questions about the water situation here. Sarah invited her in, noting how Walsh's eyes immediately catalogued everything, the engineering textbooks still stacked on the kitchen table, the geological surveys Patricia had left behind, the view of the construction site through the window. Dr. Vance's preliminary report was quite thorough, Walsh said, settling into a kitchen chair. She documented significant environmental impact from the Millbrook development. I understand you've been affected directly. They stole my water, Sarah said simply. Diverted the spring that's fed this farm for 3 generations. Walsh made notes on a tablet, asking detailed questions about the timeline of the water loss, the original flow rates, and the impact on Sarah's farming operation. But her questions grew more pointed as the conversation continued. Dr. Vance also documented unusual drainage patterns at the construction site. Flooding in areas that shouldn't flood, backed up culvert systems, foundation settlement that's inconsistent with normal weather effects. Walsh's eyes were sharp and professional. In your opinion, what might have caused such extensive drainage problems? Sarah felt the weight of the question. Walsh was giving her an opportunity to confess, or perhaps to implicate herself without realizing it. Poor planning, Sarah said finally. They built on unsuitable soil without proper environmental assessment. When you ignore hydrology, hydrology doesn't ignore you. Walsh nodded slowly. And your background in hydraulic engineering would give you particular insight into these issues. It wasn't a question. Sarah realized that Walsh had done her homework, knew exactly who she was talking to and what Sarah was capable of. 40 years of experience teaches you to read the signs, Sarah agreed. Any engineer could have told them that clay soil and high water tables don't mix well with residential construction. Any engineer who was consulted, Walsh said meaningfully. They finished the interview with Walsh asking for documentation of the farm's water usage and environmental impact. Sarah provided everything she had, including records going back to her husband's time and the original geological surveys from when they'd first developed the property. As Walsh prepared to leave, she paused at the door. Mrs. Chen, off the record, I've been investigating environmental violations for 15 years. I've seen a lot of cases where developers cut corners and communities pay the price. Her expression was carefully neutral. Sometimes nature finds a way to correct these imbalances. When it does, my job is to document the consequences and make sure they don't happen again. After Walsh left, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The inspector clearly suspected something, but she seemed more interested in building a case against Millbrook than pursuing the details of how their drainage problems had occurred. That afternoon brought unexpected visitors. Thomas returned from town with news that other farmers in the valley were organizing. Word had spread about the environmental investigation, and people were beginning to understand the broader implications of Millbrook's water diversions. Mrs. Patterson lost her well completely, Thomas reported, referring to their neighbor 2 miles south. The Johnsons are down to a trickle. Even the Martinelli Ranch is having problems, and they've got the deepest wells in the valley. Sarah wasn't surprised. Her calculations had predicted this. The spring system fed a much larger area than most people realized, and Millbrook's diversions would eventually affect everyone who depended on the underground aquifer. What are they planning to do? They want to file a class action lawsuit. Water rights violations, environmental damage, loss of livelihood, the whole thing. Thomas's expression was complicated. They want you to be the lead plaintiff. Your engineering background, the fact that you were affected first, the documentation you've gathered. It would mean years in court, Sarah said. And Millbrook has deeper pockets than all of us combined. Maybe. But now we have the state investigation. Dr. Walsh seemed pretty serious about finding violations. That evening, Sarah's phone rang with calls from farmers throughout the valley. People she'd known for decades, families who'd worked the land for generations, all of them facing the same crisis she'd been fighting alone for months. The conversation that stuck with her was from Maria Santos, whose family had run a small dairy operation since the 1960s. Maria's voice was thick with tears as she described watching her cattle suffer from insufficient water, knowing that her children might be the last generation to work the land their grandparents had died protecting. We can't fight them alone, Sarah, Maria said. But together, maybe we have a chance. By Friday, the situation at the Millbrook site had deteriorated further. Sarah could see workers with pumps trying to remove standing water from around the model home's foundation, but the saturated clay soil wasn't cooperating. Every gallon they pumped out was replaced by 2 more seeping up from the water table. Richard Hawthorne arrived at the construction site in a convoy of vehicles that included engineers, lawyers, and what appeared to be insurance adjusters. Sarah watched through binoculars as they examined the foundation damage, pointing at cracks and taking measurements that looked increasingly grim. The sound of her phone ringing interrupted her surveillance. Patricia's voice was tight with controlled excitement. Sarah, you need to see the news. Channel 7 just ran a story about Millbrook's environmental violations. Sarah turned on her television to find a reporter standing outside the construction site, gesturing toward the flooded foundation while explaining the state investigation. The story covered the water rights dispute, the environmental impact on local farms, and what the reporter called serious structural problems with Millbrook's construction methods. But the most damaging part was an interview with Dr. Walsh, who explained in careful, technical language exactly why building on saturated clay soil was a recipe for long-term disaster. The foundation settlement we're observing is just the beginning, Walsh said. As soil conditions continue to deteriorate, residents could face ongoing structural problems, flooding issues, and potentially dangerous living conditions. The story included interviews with several valley farmers, including Maria Santos, who broke down on camera while describing the impact on her dairy operation. The reporter presented it as a David and Goliath story: family farms versus corporate development, environmental protection versus profit. By evening, the story had been picked up by regional news networks and environmental advocacy groups. Sarah's phone started ringing with interview requests from reporters who wanted to speak with the engineer who predicted the problems. She declined them all. The last thing she needed was media attention that might prompt closer investigation of how Millbrook's drainage problems had developed so rapidly. Saturday brought a development that Sarah hadn't anticipated. A convoy of vehicles arrived at the construction site, but instead of more engineers, they carried equipment for packing up and securing the job site. Work had been suspended pending the results of the environmental investigation. Hawthorne appeared at Sarah's door that afternoon, but this time he wasn't alone. With him was a woman in an expensive suit who introduced herself as Amanda Cross, Millbrook's senior legal counsel. Mrs. Chen, Cross said in the tone of someone accustomed to getting her way, we need to discuss the situation frankly. Sarah invited them in, curious about what Millbrook's endgame might be. Cross took the lead in the conversation, with Hawthorne sitting silently beside her like a chastened child. The state investigation has created some temporary complications for our development timeline, Cross began. We are confident that we can address the technical issues and proceed with the project, but the legal challenges are going to take time and money to resolve. I imagine they would, Sarah said mildly. Which brings us to our revised offer. Cross pulled out a folder thick with legal documents. Millbrook is prepared to purchase your property for 3 times the assessed value, that's approximately $4 million, and to include restoration of full water rights as part of the deal. Sarah felt her breath catch. $4 million was more money than she'd ever imagined, enough to set up Thomas for life and buy land anywhere they wanted. But there were conditions, she was certain. In exchange for what, she asked. Your signature on a comprehensive settlement agreement. No lawsuits, no media statements, no participation in class action claims against Millbrook. Cross's smile was sharp as a blade. Complete resolution of all disputes related to water rights and environmental impact. And if you refuse? Cross's expression hardened. Then we proceed with our original development plan. We address the Technica,